This is the fifth module of the Initiatic Mysteries of Classical Antiquity. We're going to be talking about the Eleusinian Mysteries. This is part one. It introduces you to the Cretan Minoan origins of the Eleusinian Mysteries and some of the other background you'll need in order to understand them. When this part is finished, you'll need to open up and click on part two of the Eleusinian Mysteries. Both of these are part of this one module because the files are so large. We first need to understand the distinction between the Apollonian, the Dionysian, and the Orphic mysteries. By Apollonian, we refer to the mysteries that were eventually put together by the priests of Apollo. Now, the priests of Apollo belonged to the Mycenaean civilization, which was rather warlike and moved down from the north and invaded the Aegean, and was part of the fall of the more matriarchal or partnership type of culture that we had on Crete, the Cretan Minoan civilization. And yet they took all the mysteries that they had found and all the sacred places they had found, and they reinterpreted them. So they brought within their purview the mysteries that had existed beforehand, but they handled them through their Apollonian priesthood. Now, Apollo was a god of the Mycenaeans, but he was actually an earlier god on Crete with a different name. And this is a god of ecstasy and trance. He was the shaman god, the male shaman god. And the Apollonian traditions are derived from Cretan Minoan chthonic traditions. These chthonic traditions meaning traditions about the divine underworld, the world underworld which contains the riches of everything from metals to agriculture, the fruits of the ground. And these chthonic mysteries were also mortuary mysteries. That is, they had to do with the mysteries of death. And they were also oracular traditions, traditions of giving prophecy. And there were oracles and sibyls that existed at certain sacred places in certain caves. And they took over their locations. And so the Apollonian tradition ultimately was derived from the older Cretan Minoan chthonic, mortuary, and oracular traditions, but they were modified by the Mycenaean priesthood of Apollo. And some of the things that this is important for were the greater and lesser mysteries of ELEUSIS, which were originally practiced in a different form as public rites and possibly puberty rites on the Cretan island. The Oracle of Delphi and the Oracle of Trophonius and the other oracular traditions. The Pythagorean full Arctic mysteries of descent into the divine underworld, which we'll be discussing, and the whole business of Orphic piety and devotion, the Orphic hymns, not so much a religion as it is a general kind of movement of piety. And the Apollonian tradition was a tradition that was noetic, that involved meditation, contemplation, yet had a male orientation. The top gods were male, like Zeus, and the feminine deities had been subjugated by the male deities, but they still were powerful in their own ways. And the Apollonian traditions were those that appealed to the philosophers and that appealed to those who were the earliest scientists and so on. And they were actually the earliest traditions that we find in the earlier periods of Greek before we come to the middle point of classical Greek tradition. However, from Asia Minor, from modern-day Turkey and so on, there were other movements that came in that we call enthusiastic traditions. It's en means in, and enthusia means to be spiritually infused and to be possessed by the spirit of a goddess or a god. And it's derived from these ecstatic and erotic festivals, which related to the kinds of rites that were done of fertility, which involved copulation in the fields of a priest and a priestess and things like this that came from this area. So the Dionysian traditions were the ecstatic traditions that involve large numbers of people. One didn't have to even apply for admission. One was just caught up by the spirit and did this sort of thing. So they were derived from the festivals of the Magna Mater, the Great Mother, from Asia Minor. And some of these would include all those of Dionysius, which are, or Dionysus as it's called in the Latin, which are the some of the first traditions that actually make their way and invade the Eleusinian mysteries. And then those of Kubale and Begali, which were the castrated priests, the self-castrated priests, and the traditions of Attis and Adonis and so on. So the distinction then is that the Apollonian traditions were those that derived really from the Cretan Minoan sources as modified by the Mycenaean priesthood of Apollo. And this is what we're going to be looking at in the Eleusinian mysteries. Now, there are two books that I recommend very highly if you don't already own them, in order to understand some of the basic concepts that we're going to be dealing with. The first is called The Chalice and the Blade by Rianne Eisler. You can order these books from Amazon.com or anywhere else. This is a wonderful and very accessible explanation of the impact that patriarchal forces in society, patriarchal cultures like that of the Mycenaeans, had upon the older matriarchal and partnership cultures that were like those of the Cretan Minoans, how they interacted. And it's back in the days when God was a woman, not a man. And it's important to read and understand, because a lot of the concepts that we'll be dealing with in the mystery cults and the mystery religions are rooted in these traditions. The other book is by a wonderful classicist named Peter Kingsley. He is the new breed of classicist who got beyond the blinders that were worn by the older classicists with their simplistic interpretations of the pre-Socratic philosophers and so on, who was able to synthesize and put things together based on more and more data and information to understand what the spiritual aspect of the pre-Socratics and the Pythagorean and the Orphic elements of Greek religion and piety was. And this is a very simple book. It's a book that is written in a style that will envelop you and help you to understand from beginning to end some things that are very complex, and yet give you a concept that will go with you very permanently. It's called In the Dark Places of Wisdom by Peter Kingsley. I strongly recommend you get this book. We're going to begin by looking at the Cretan Initiatic mysteries, the mysteries that were practiced on the Isle of Crete by the Cretan Minoan civilization, which did not use the Greek alphabet. It used a form of writing that we call Linear B. And this culture can be dated back to about 5,000 years before the Christian era. It probably arose from colonies of the Egyptians, because they brought with them the knowledge of agriculture of grains, which is agriculture of wheat and barley, and how to winnow the grain and how to make it into bread, which nobody else knew anything about. And that became very central to their world in their life, because they lived on an island, and all they would do is for food is to fish, some trade, and agriculture. Homer describes the Cretan Minoan civilization in this way. He says, there is a fair and fruitful island in mid-ocean called Crete. It is thickly populated, and there are 90 cities in it. The people speak many different languages which overlap one another. For there are Achaeans, brave Eteocretians, Dorians of threefold race, and noble Pelasgi. There is a great town there called Knossos, where King Minos reigned, who every 9 years had a conference with Zeus himself. Well, all these are ruins today, but we know much about the culture. We know that the men were not involved in warfare. The bureaucratic aspects of running the culture were done by women. And the highest god was a goddess, not a god. And the goddess had male consorts, but just like a family in the older times that was centered around the woman and around the hearth, the whole culture was centered around the great goddess. And men worked in winnowing the grain and fishing, but men were very artistic. They played the pipes and played musical instruments and were involved in the arts a great deal. And it was a very different kind of culture than they have today. If we look at the remains at Knossos and Phaistos and Hagia Triad and other cities, we find an intensely religious people who had cults of the dead, tree and pillar cults, ritual bull sacrifices, doves symbolizing the presence of the gods, butterflies symbolizing the soul, ritual dancing with bulls, bare-breasted women wearing beautiful flouncy dresses, taking place in an open corridor theater arena, colorful fresco paintings and architecture and sculpture attributed to the legendary Daedalus. And it collapsed very suddenly around 1400 years before the Christian era. We have today some of the ruins of the palace at Knossos. And one of the interesting things to look at is the ubiquitous horns, which are shown everywhere. This monument you see at the right-hand side of the screen is a very large kind of a monolith carved into the shape of bull's horns. And the symbol of the bull's horns were because the bull was considered to be a symbol of the moon and the lunar goddess, and the goddess was the mother. And you find these on altars, the horns of the altar, which you will hear described even as late as in Jewish, ancient Hebrew religion, in the Solomon Temple, etc. So here we have some of the remains of this culture. This is a diagram of what was in the palace at Knossos. There was a royal road that led to a great theater area where there were drama and various kinds of receptions, throne rooms, places for people to be washed ceremonially, lustral basins, beautifully done drains and sewers so that it could survive the climate, kings and queens areas. There were kings as well as queens, and many other kinds of things. Now, in and about the time of the year 1400 BC, the island was probably shaken by a very great earthquake. You see, that whole area, and this will become terribly important in the next module, is centered on places of high tectonic activity. There's a lot of volcanic activity that takes place. That's important for the understanding of Delphic Oracle, for understanding Empedocles and why he jumped into a volcano, and also very massive earthquakes and that have even possibly sunk islands and caused them to sink below the sea. An island, you know, is not part of a continent, so it really can sink, although continents cannot sink. But around this time, a combination perhaps of geological catastrophes, invasions of patriarchal culture and civilizations, and piracy and so on, really just took the whole culture down, just destroyed it, and destroyed a lot of its buildings. And at that time, legend tells us that Demeter, who was one of the gods, and the god, in fact, of grain, in Crete, came or migrated over to Athens and taught people how to sow wheat. Now, this is an image of the ruins as they stand and as they probably stood, victimized by fire and by earthquake and the ravages of weather and piracy and looting. And here's an image of an urn of Cretan men winnowing wheat. These great big fans are winnowing fans to separate the wheat from the chaff. Now, we will find when we read about this that there will be reference to the corn. Now, we're not talking about corn, i.e. maize, that the Europeans were introduced to by the American Indians. We're talking about, when we say a corn of something, we're talking about a corn of wheat or a corn of barley or a corn of some other kind of grain like millet. A corn means a seed. And she was the goddess who had introduced people to the agriculture of this, the mysteries of how it's planted, how it's harvested, how it's winnowed, and how it's ground into bread and baked. So this was the staff of life, and she was the goddess that oversaw this. This was being done on the island of Crete and in Egypt before it was being done anywhere else in the Mediterranean, and her, Demeter's exit from the island over to Athens is, in legend and in myth, is the time when the mysteries of the sowing of and harvesting of this grain were established. Now, if we look at the linear B alphabet of the gods of Crete, these are the names of some of the gods. Poseidon, the god of the sea, of course, would be very important, but he's a Greek god. Zeus, but Zeus is not the great big daddy god of the Greeks with the big chest and the flowing beard. He is a kouros. That means he is the eternal youth. He's the eternally young immortal. Now, this is a term that's going to become very important in the mysteries, the kore, which is the feminine version of from the same root. Persephone is called the kore, the maiden, wrongly translated as virgin in the sense of sexual virgin. She is the ever young, eternally living, youthful, beautiful, radiant, desirable, feminine creature who rules as queen of the underworld, as the wife of Pluto, whose name means riches, wealth, because out of the earth comes the wealth, comes the jewels and the metals and the grains and the other things that grow up from the earth. So the underworld was considered to be a place of great light and beauty and wealth, and it's the source of the wealth of human beings. And the kouros, or the kore, was the ever youthful deity who lived forever in the form of a young man at his prime. And his wife, Hera, Athena, Artemis, Demeter, Persephone, and then Eileithyia. And Eileithyia is very important because she's the old and ancient Gaia oracle who gave forth prophecies and visions from a cave on the island, and out of which really much of the language and technical things developed from pure shamanistic origins to the highly developed and civilized mystery development of priesthood and so on. And Ares, Hermes, Dionysus, and Pion. Now you say, well, I know all those names, but I don't know Eileithyia. Well, I've explained a little who she was. She's really the Gaia, the earth oracle. Now, Pion is the god of trance and music, and he's going to be taken over by the Apollonian priests in the Mycenaean invasions and appropriated to their god Apollo, who is a god of war, who now is going to become a god of music and he plays the lyre and the flute, and he's a god of prophecy, and he's the god of trance, etc. So Pion is really what Apollo is going to become after this civilization is conquered. Here is the Cretan Minoan version of Zeus. We don't see the big beard, we don't see the brawny muscles, the hairy chest, anything. What we see is a very thin and artistic-looking young man holding a thunderbolt. And that is the Cretan Minoan version of Zeus. This would be Zeus the kouros, the divine youth. Now, in the 3rd millennium before the Christian era, there was a cave. We call it the cave of Eileithyia at Amnisus. And she was related to the Minoan goddess of childbirth. And that cave was the place where the oracles and the sibyls, the female shamanesses, held forth. And I've explained that Pion was later merged with Apollo, and that Demeter, I should explain, is from the Cretan word dei, which means barley, and Meter, which means mother. She means the barley mother. This is an image of what was the ancient cave of prophecy on the Isle of Crete, the cave of Gaia, just as originally the oracle at Delphi was a cave of Gaia and the priestesses of Gaia, or the shamanic sibyls of Gaia. Now, we know that the initiation in the 3rd millennium before the Christian era, this is an image of what was. Now, we know that the initiation that we find later incorporated into the Eleusinian mysteries was done at Knossos in Crete. I'm going to read you a little bit about that initiation. I'm reading you from Diodorus Siculus. He says, such then are the myths which the Cretans recount of the gods who they claim were born in their land. They also assert that the honors accorded to the gods and their sacrifices and the initiatory rites observed in connection with the mysteries were handed down from Crete to the rest of men. And to support this, they advance the following most weighty argument as they conceive it. The initiatory rite, which is celebrated by the Athenians in ELEUSIS, the most famous, one may venture, of them all, and that of Samothrace, and the one practiced in Thrace among the Cicones, whence Orpheus came, who introduced them. These are all handed down in the form of a mystery. Whereas at Knossos in Crete, it had been the custom from ancient times that these initiatory rites should be handed down to all openly. And what is handed down among other peoples as not to be divulged, this the Cretans conceal from no one who may wish to inform himself upon such matters. Indeed, the majority of the gods, the Cretans say, had their beginning in Crete and set out from there to visit many regions of the inhabited world, conferring benefactions upon the races of men and distributing among each of them the advantage which resulted from the discoveries they had made. Demeter, for example, crossed over into Attica and then removed from there to Sicily and afterward to Egypt. And in these lands, her choicest gift was that of the corn. That means the wheat and barley and the seeds of the grasses and grains, and instructions in the sowing of it, whereupon she received great honors at the hands of those whom she had benefited. Well, we know archaeologically this is true. This is where all the Greek gods, most of the Olympic gods came from this place. Now, there is another thing we should say. There was a practice that was done. It was associated with the public mysteries that they did in Knossos. They initiated who? They initiated really young children who were coming into puberty. They went through the kinds of initiatic rituals that later on we would find greatly elaborated at ELEUSIS. But these were not private and concealed mysteries. These were public puberty rites, initiations. And they were initiation into immortality and apotheosis, not just into the tribe and not just into adulthood. Later on in the Eleusinian mysteries, we will hear of Demophoon, the divine child, who leads people in the dancing, and the importance of Demophoon, and the taking of one child from the city of Athens and having the state pay for his initiation. That's because it goes back to the original initiation of the puberty-aged children, 12, 13-year-olds, in Crete and in Knossos. So the importance of the child in the Eleusinian mysteries goes back to this. Another thing that was done in association with these mysteries was that the corns, that is the seeds of the wheat and the barley and so on, were chosen from the absolute best stocks. In other words, the largest and best grains were not eaten, but they were going to be dried and kept for planting next year so that they could have even better and greater crops. It makes a lot of sense. It's genetic science, and it's the kind of thing that Luther Burbank did and that early Americans did with Indian maize to turn it into nice big pieces of corn from the little wimpy things they used to be. But they take the best of each year's crop, they would dry it, and what they would do in Crete would be to bury it as in a burial chamber under the earth so that it could be fertilized and fructified by the divine underworld. And very often they buried it even in places where there were dead bodies, or where they were grave places. The grave was considered to be a person planted in the ground, was like a seed that would sprout again. This image I'm showing you is from a Neolithic grave site, because we don't have any pictures of the murky, what were called the murky underground caverns of Persephone by the Cretans, where the wheat grains and the barley grains were stored over the winter to be planted in the spring. But we do see in this photograph from my gravesite that it was common to put flowers and things like this in the graves with people. These are in fact metal flowers that were made to represent the flowers that would be put in the grave. But this practice was done in Crete as part of the mysteries. Now, the mother goddess of the Cretan Minoans was always associated with serpents or snakes and with the symbols of the moon, which are the horns of the bull and so on. Here is one example of what has been called the Minoan snake goddess, which is, I think, a rather trite phrase, but you see that she's bare-breasted. Her breasts are she's beautiful. She's not big and fat like a fertility idol. She's a beautiful woman, and she's holding in each of her hands a serpent, a snake. Now, the snake was a pet that was kept in the homes of people in the ancient Near East, especially in Greece and in Crete, rather than, and as opposed to what we think of as pets, cats and dogs. The Egyptians had domesticated cats and had them as pets, but in Greek households, there was always a serpent, a snake, who lived near the hearth. And he crawled into a hole back there, and they came out and people fed him, and he caught mice, and he was a pet. And he was considered to be not the evil thing that came out in the Hebrew creation story of the snake, but a great and marvelous creature who was a benefactor of mankind, later would be associated with the pattern that the sun makes through the zodiac, etc., and with Zeus and with Kronos, and in the Mithraic mysteries and many other places. And here she holds the snakes, the serpents, which are also symbols of fertility. And on her head is a cat. And that, to me, indicates a relationship with the Egyptian culture as well. And we find this symbol, the double-bladed axe with the blades being rounded off in the form of crescent moon. We find it everywhere in the Cretan Minoan ruins. Not utility axes that you would pick up and break something with, but little small ones, an inch long, or great giant ones 8 feet tall that were made out of stone and put up with the horns of the bull at the bottom. These were symbols of the waxing and waning moon. And these were symbols of fertility and of the mother goddess. We find them everywhere. They're like religious symbols to that religion, so to speak, what would be like the cross is to Christianity. And we find the symbol also of the bull and the bull's head and the bull's horns, the symbol of the complete circle. And the bull itself was sacred in Crete, just as cows are sacred in India. And the bull was not butchered in contests with the bull, as it became later in bullfights and so on. The bull was played with. Young men would perform acrobatic feats with the bull and run with the bulls, etc., but not to kill the bulls. Later on, bullfighting developed from these kinds of roots, but in the Cretan Minoan civilization, the bull was a sacred animal and representative of many good things for the culture. The men, as I say, did not engage in warfare, not even any more than you do when you involved in trade, but they fished and they and helped with farming, and they were also artists, and they made things, and they were musicians. They played music, and the women danced. And dancing, sacred dancing, is a terribly important legacy from the Cretans that became an absolute mark of sacred worship in ancient Greece. The choric dancing, which is led by one person, and everybody imitates that one person. And there got to be highly stylized and developed forms of dancing that people were taught, and they actually had to go to school and study them. In the Eleusinian mysteries, the choric dancing was sacred dancing that was led by a child, and the child was trained carefully in all these things, and people would learn these dances, and by learning the dances, they were taking upon themselves the powers and the feelings and the orge, or the passion, which means the pain and suffering and experience of the deity. And this was well developed in Crete, and this dancing was mostly done in Crete by women. We see most of the pictures we see are women dancing and men playing instruments. But the dances show that women very often are dancing all together in concert, doing the same kind of thing. So sacred dance was a very important thing that was developed in Crete and transferred over to the mainland and became the hallmark of the sacred mysteries, whether they be the Apollonian or the Dionysian. So now we're going to take a look at the Eleusinian mysteries. It began in the time of the year of September, around the time of the equinox of fall, as an ancient agricultural festival. It was a harvest festival, a festival of fall and the equinox. And we know that before the Eleusinian mysteries were operating, there were still cleansings and celebrations that were done by the ocean, and that as the whole business of the developing of the crops of wheat and barley began to be introduced into the area, that these festivals and the harvest festivals became very important. This was a time when the grains were harvested. Now we know that the Eleusinian mysteries have a chthonic basis. They're based in the divine underworld, just like the Osirian mysteries and like the Cretan mysteries. We know that really the most important god or goddess of the Eleusinian mysteries is really not Demeter, even though Demeter is the founder of the mysteries, the divine mother. It's really her child, Persephone, the Kore, which means a youthful queen. She is the regenerate, the immortal queen of the divine underworld, married to Hades, or Pluto as he's known. And she is the queen of the mysteries of death and immortality. And she didn't just get to be that way because of the Eleusinian mysteries. She was that way much before the Eleusinian mysteries. And she is very, very important later on in all the Orphic traditions and all the chthonic traditions of the Greeks. This is an image of the Kore, the maiden, the youth, the maiden who lives in the underworld and who rules it, Persephone. Now Demeter is, at this point, becomes really very much associated with the Gaia images. Gaia is, of course, Earth, Mother Earth, but Demeter, because of her association with the seed crops and especially the wheat and barley and all these sorts of things, and the things that come up out of the ground, all of agriculture, blurs together with Gaia to become the ancient matriarchal goddess of the earth. And her rites introduced mankind to the agriculture of wheat and barley and other grains and the making of bread, which, as we know, historically seem to originate in Egypt. This is a representation of Demeter as the mother of the grains. She has in her hand a divine sickle, a golden sickle. She has in her hand the various kinds of fruits of different kinds of grains, etc., and she sits on her throne with her crown. And the Eleusinian mysteries sublimated and transformed all this, the mystery of cyclic death and rebirth, harvesting and planting and sowing and growing and coming to another harvest, this great cyclic mystery, with the mystery of human death and the divinization, the apotheosis of mortals from a mortal to an immortal state in the mysteries. And the Eleusinian mysteries were revered for 2.5 millennia as the highest and most exalted of the mysteries. And it's very important to understand that in Greece, initiation was not given just by getting to be 12 years old. Initiation was based on your personal character and your proven integrity, and you were nominated by an initiate for initiation. And the reward of being faithful to the ideals of the mysteries was immortality. And that immortality, a transition from a human to a divine state, or a continuation of the divine and immortal state that already lives in your soul, was based on and depended upon your moral, ethical conduct during life. And so it was not something that was given because you were a member of the upper classes or you were a member of the pharaoh's family. It was not based on paying a lot of money to priests. In fact, it could never be, an initiation can never be bought or sold. It cost money, but in order to be initiated, you had to be a very high character and recommended by another. And it was not an initiation into priesthood. It was an initiation into the road and the path to immortality. It was like what we might call an empowerment. Now we know that there were originally public rites that initiated people into the mysteries of Demeter on the island of Crete. Well, this was a private version of the original Demeter rites, and on the island of Crete, children were initiated as part of their puberty rites, and especially in the city of Knossos. We know that children were trained and given much long training before they were accepted as initiates. And most people, however, were not initiated as children. They were initiated as young adults at an older age. However, there is a very major portion of the Greek mythology that deals with the little child, the Mophon, which literally means something like the light of the people. And there was always chosen one young child who was actually earlier than the age of initiation would be, to be initiated and to learn the sacred rites and to lead the people in dancing. And this was embedded into the mythology and legend of how the rites were established. And this undoubtedly goes back to these puberty rites and puberty initiations on the Isle of Crete. Today, if we look at the archaeological ruins of ELEUSIS, we find quite a mess. They have not been restored. They're rather difficult to get to, and the governments have preserved them as they are, but we find that the great buildings which were knocked down and taken down and have been taken down by the ravages of weather as well, have not really been restored in the way that some of the Egyptian antiquities have been restored, and that other antiquities have been restored in Athens, for example. So the modern ruins of Eleusis simply stand out as they are as ruins. If we take a look at the ruins of Eleusis, we can see that it was built partially into an area. It was built on a hill, on a mountain. It's interesting that the mysteries, and especially the chthonic mysteries, very often were built on hills, but went into caves in the hills. And the Eleusinian mysteries were all the entire sacred precincts were built on a high place, and you had to walk up to that high place. And in the ancient times, there were not buildings and city encroaching upon the area as there is today. There was, in fact, along quite a distance between the city of Athens and Eleusis. Now we can see a reconstruction of what we speculate Eleusis might have looked like. The buildings included a road and a path that came into the sacred precincts and the temples from over a bridge that crossed part of the bay and a river, actually. And we can see that originally there was probably just one telesterion and one anacteron, one little temple where the work was done, and a sacred grove. These grew over the years to include temples to Pluto or Hades and all kinds of other additions to the property that was managed by one family, the family, the Eumolpidae. The Eumolpidids were the people to whom the mysteries of Eleusis were revealed by Demeter, according to legend. And they then, as a family, held on to the priesthood of Eleusis, and they ran the sacred mysteries as a dynasty for 2,500 years. Now, to give you an idea of how powerful the mysteries became and how respected they were, the Roman Emperor Caligula was a great devotee of the Greek mysteries. He wished to be initiated at Eleusis, and he applied for initiation. He was turned down. Why? Because of his character. Because he did not meet the moral and ethical requirements for initiation. Now, Caligula was the strongest dictator who had ever existed in the Roman Empire by this time, and he could have simply sent a contingent of his soldiers over to smash and destroy the entire complex. But if he'd done that, he would have been overthrown. His own guard would have turned on him and killed him, and he would have gone down forever in history as even more satanic than he was, and he was very satanic. So you see, the priests of Eleusis had not only the moral power, but the actual political power to preserve the purity of the initiates. And for 2,500 years, the secrets of Eleusis, the secrets that were sworn to be kept secret by the initiates, were never divulged. We cannot find any place in literature where anything relating to the mysteries and the inner workings of Eleusis were ever revealed. It came very close to a little bit being revealed in one of the plays of the playwrights, who was very strongly excoriated, but he denied that he had ever been initiated, and that what he had in his plays was simply hearsay. But basically, the mysteries were kept holy and sacred, and silence was kept about them by all these initiates for all these many, many years, something that just would not happen in the 20th or 21st century for any institution. the grounds of Eleusis were built near a hilltop, which is called an acropolis. And if you look towards the bottom of this map, the sanctuary, you'll see the telesterion. There are sites of some fortifications and some other things around the area. There's a small stadium and a theater, a sacred grove, and a road that leads to the harbor, and another one which is called the Sacred Way, which you'll see on your right side, which leads to Athens. Now, there are Mycenaean burial sites nearby. This was a sacred place, a sacred site to the Mycenaeans, and probably earlier to the early inhabitants, and had been for probably 500-800 years before Eleusis was founded here. You'll notice that in Mycenaean burial, that the person is buried with his arms straight out to his side and with symbols of his accomplishments, because the Mycenaeans were warlike, and also with symbols of resurrection and rebirth. And so a place of burial was a place that was also a place of connection with the divine underworld and with immortality. This is the Calicoron well, which is the very centerpiece of this sacred place. Places where wells spring up are considered to be places of prophecy. The Hebrew word nabi, prophet, means a bubbling well, or one who bubbles like a well. And this well existed from ancient times and was considered to be a sacred well, a sacred place where muses would inspire people with dreams and with prophecy. And this is the sort of the central area about which this is built. It's somewhat comparable, as we'll look at in another module when we look at the Oracle at Delphi. It's somewhat comparable to the omphalos, or the navel of the world. The grounds of Eleusis were built near a hilltop, which is called. This is the grounds of. This is a plan of the different megarons, or places that were constructed as enclosed in the area. They would have been the housing for the priests and housing for guests and people that were working with them. We can see as we go through examples A, B, C, D, and E, the development of the telesterion, where the mysteries were carried out from the time of Solon. It was rather small, A, and Pisistratus, we have a larger telesterion, and then letter C, we have an even larger one, and all the way from the time of Herakles, Roman Empire, a very large one. But notice that there is a little rectangle in each of these. That little rectangle is called the enacteron, and that is the place where the highest form of the mysteries was enacted, where the visions were seen, the Visio Beatifica, and where the great light emanated, so bright that it illuminated the entire bay at midnight. People tell us, who were reporting on what they saw from a distance. This is a plan of the grounds, quite developed grounds now, not the earliest forms of the mysteries, etc. But now we have everything from a triumphal arch and a temple of Artemis to sacred houses for priests to live in, and all this sort of thing. From this map, you can take a look at where the walls of the precincts were in the Archaic period, and how they expanded in the Classical period, and finally in the Hellenistic and Roman period expanded even further. This is typical of sacred sites. At the very top, you see the word Acropolis. That means the top of the mountain. In order to understand the Eleusinian mysteries, we have to look at two things. We have to look at what we call the lesser mysteries and the greater mysteries. And in order to understand the lesser mysteries, we have to understand the archetype of the human who achieves apotheosis. Apotheosis is immortality. The human being who is born human, but after death is immortal. Whether he lives in the Elysian fields or in the night skies and the stars or in any other modality, this is the concept of the hero. The hero is a Greek word, does not mean what we mean by hero, somebody that pulls a child out of a flaming building or something. A hero means a person who is half human and half divine, and spent his life making the divine part of himself good and permanent so that when he died, he became immortal. So this is the pattern of the mysteries, and this is what the mysteries initiates people into. So let's take a look at this pattern of the hero. The great archetype of the hero for the mysteries is Herakles, also known as Hercules in Latin. He's the archetypal initiate of any of the Apollonian mysteries and of the Eleusinian mysteries. And now we're going to have other heroes who are going to be the archetypes of other mysteries, Orpheus, Adonis, those who were murdered or committed suicide and were reborn, etc. Or healers like Asclepius, who mediated healing from the gods through incubation. People would go to the temples of Asclepius, who now is a god, and they would sleep in the temples, and through their dreams and through divine dreaming, which is called incubation or eridinia, they would receive healing. So there are different types of heroes among the Greeks. We're going to look, though, at the great hero of the mysteries, Herakles, and his initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries is basically a shamanic initiation. And one might even say that it represents possibly the more Mycenaean and patriarchal male type aspect of the Eleusinian mysteries. They were called the lesser mysteries of Herakles. Now, who was Herakles? Well, he was a son of Zeus through Amphitryon, so therefore he was a demigod. He was half mortal and half immortal. Now, according to the myths, the first name of Herakles was Alcides. His father was Amphitryon, and he was married to Alcmena. And while the father was gone off to war, Zeus took the form of Amphitryon and lay with his wife Alcmena, and made love to her and conceived the child who would first be called Alcides, but later Herakles. And when Amphitryon arrived and she told him that he had come the night before and slept with her, he went to Tiresias, who is the great seer, the blind seer, who told him how Zeus had enjoyed his wife and slept with her. So, according to myth, when this child Herakles was about to be born, Zeus declared that a descendant of Perseus, who was then about to be born, would be the king of Mycenae. But Hera, who was very unhappy with Zeus for going and laying with a mortal woman, out of jealousy persuaded Eileithyia, who was goddess of childbirth, to retard Alcmena's delivery so that the delivery would be late, and contrived that Eurystheus, who was also a descendant of Perseus, should be born a 7-month child. And this is how Herakles lost the throne of Mycenae, the patriarchal warlike culture. And so this is how Herakles was born, and he was born immediately with an enemy, the wife of Zeus, Hera. And Hera would be his enemy throughout his whole life and send him afflictions. And his life would be a matter of overcoming the afflictions sent by heaven, sent by this goddess Hera, to afflict him. And he would have some help, because he was gifted by many of the gods and the goddesses who came to his aid. He was taught to drive a chariot by Amphitryon, his supposed father, to a wrestle by Autolycus, and he was taught the art of archery by Eurytus, and all the great heroes of the Mycenaean kingdom taught him mortal things, but he received a special sword from the god Hermes, and bows and arrows from Apollo, and a golden breastplate from Hephaestus, and a robe from Athena. And so he was beloved by certain other gods and goddesses who would help him and intercede for him at certain times. And Hera sent upon him madness to cause him to commit human sins at different times of his life. And in order to atone for those sins, for those wrongs that he had done in his life, he had to perform what were originally 10 labors, and then later in mythological and legendary history they became 12 labors. And these 12 labors were the way that he worked his way through 12 degrees of initiation, from being the lowest form of human, a murderer of his own children, to the greatest achievement among humans, one who was able to descend to the divine underworld and who died the most noble kind of death that all heroes who become apotheosized will experience in some form or another, the death of fire. And for the mysteries, the implications are many. One is that all humans have the seeds of divine immortality and have the power to cultivate them. Because even though we say that, well, Herakles was half human and half divine, he was a demigod because he had Zeus for a father, this was considered to be an allegory of the fact that we all have Zeus for a father. In other words, we are all half human and half divine, and the soul is the immortal part of the human body. And another implication is that apotheosis after death can be attained by effort and by overcoming trials. And these trials are seen as having come from psychic attacks and spiritual enemies. Hera, in this case, acts the part of the Christian Satan or devil. And these trials are generated from two sources. One is internal, one's own misdeeds, what we might call one's own karma. These are the mistakes that Herakles made, because the things that he did because he was weak and could not resist the magical suggestions that came upon him to do evil things. And then there are external roots, attacks from evil forces more powerful than oneself, in this case, Hera. So Herakles is really the archetype of the struggle for every human being who struggles spiritually to achieve spiritual attainment through the trials of life. So let's examine the life of Herakles. You already know that he was the son of Zeus and that Hera was jealous of what Zeus had done. Zeus made a prophecy that was intended for Herakles, that would cause him to become king of the Mycenaeans. However, Hera was able to negate that prophecy by some magical operations, and so he was not born with the kingship. And indeed, when he was 8 months old, Hera sent serpents into his baby crib to kill him. But the child Herakles picked one up in each hand and strangled them with his mighty strength that he had already, and killed the serpents. He was educated by heroes and was outstanding in every one of the martial arts. He was gifted by the gods Hermes, Apollo, Hephaestus, and Athena, who all gave him special kinds of gifts to help him to succeed in life, even though he would not be the king of the Mycenaeans. And some of his earliest exploits, demonstrations of his virility and skill in the martial arts, were done in Boeotia and Thebes. King Thespius of Thespia in Boeotia entertained Herakles for 50 days, and each night he bedded one of his daughters with him, and from each one of those nights a child was born. And later, when Erginus, who was king of the Minions, tried to impose a tribute onto the Thebans and sent messengers to inform them that they had to pay the tribute, Herakles cut off their ears and noses and hands and sent them back to Erginus, and who marched, of course, promptly against Thebes. But Herakles got weapons from Athena and took command of the armies, killed Erginus, defeated the Minions, and obliged them to pay double the tribute to Thebes. So now he was very, very famous. And as a prize for his courage, he was given a woman, the daughter of Creon, whose name was Megara. And they had several children. Now, at this point in his life, he was driven mad by Hera. And according to some legends, he killed his wife and his children, and according to others, he killed only his children. It's most likely that that in the mysteries he killed his children, not his wife, because in some of those legends he later gives his wife to someone else. But he goes mad and murders his own children. And when he comes to his senses, he puts himself into self-exile. And he goes to Delphi and asks how he can cleanse himself from this sin. And the oracle told him he had to serve Eurystheus for 12 years. Now remember, Eurystheus is a person who Hera had caused to be born a few months early in order to take away the kingship of Mycenae from Herakles. And Eurystheus in these legends is a selfish, incompetent human being who is not worthy to be served at all. But the oracle says he has to serve this Eurystheus for 12 years and perform 12 labors to cleanse himself from sin. And at this time, when he begins the labors, he wears the skin of a lion, and that includes the head of a lion, as his uniform, as his special shamanic uniform. So he's performing, what is he performing? He's performing 10 and later on 12 shamanic acts that are deeds and feats that are way beyond the capabilities of mortals, of human beings. And he's successful in each. And he spends his life doing this, carrying on these superhuman deeds. During one of these acts, he accidentally and involuntarily kills the wisest and greatest of the centaurs, Chiron. He was hunting the Erymanthian boar and was received by Pholus the centaur. Now, a jar of wine belonging to the centaurs in common was opened, and when they discovered this, a fight broke out, and Herakles repelled them, but the centaurs took refuge with the wise centaur Chiron. And it's a long story, but basically Herakles shot Chiron involuntarily with his poisoned arrows, and the wound was incurable, and as a result of this, the wise Chiron renounced immortality and gave it to Prometheus. This is a very significant event that occurs. You see that out of the evil acts or mistakes of Herakles come great, grand, good acts like this will result in the unbinding of Prometheus, Prometheus unbound. He travels widely, has many battles and many conquests. He's continuing his work on his different labors and so on. And finally, he rescues Prometheus, where he has been bound to a rock, and his liver is eaten out every day by a giant eagle that comes and eats out his liver, and then every night the liver heals, and then the eagle comes back, and so he rescues Prometheus and unbinds him by killing the eagle. Prometheus, remember, is the one who gave the gift of immortality and divine fire to human beings. Now, at this point, he gives away his wife, Megara, and he goes mad again. Again, this madness comes from Hera, who is able to drive him mad. He kills a close friend, and he goes to Delphi again to ask what he should do to redeem himself, and he doesn't get a straight answer, and so he wrenches the tripod, the Apollonian tripod that the oracle at Delphi sits upon to deliver the oracles of Apollo. He wrenches the tripod from Apollo and just sits upon it and gets his own oracle. And then Zeus stops him from doing this and tells him to return the tripod to Apollo, and tells him he must be sold as a slave for 3 years and pay compensation. Now, what does he do? For 3 years, he's a slave to Omphale, who is a beautiful queen. And she wears his lion skin, and he dresses in women's clothes. Now, this is a fascinating interlude in the story of Herakles, because he becomes effeminate for 3 years. He actually addresses the ways and the clothing of a woman. Now, this part of the legend may have come in after the time of the mysteries of Attis and Adonis and the Magna Mater and the Galli, who castrated themselves and dressed in women's clothes. We know that a lot of great spiritual masters have done something like this. For example, Sri Ramakrishna wore women's clothes for several years and acted the part of a woman spiritually in the temples as he was doing his work. So this is an emblem of the filling out of both aspects of the soul, the masculine and feminine aspects of soul. And it was taken that way by the ancients. Then he came away from this period, put back on his lion skin, and on behalf of the Olympian gods, he fought the giants who were attacking him, and was able to defend the gods from the enemies. And he, at one point, marched against Algaeus and actually wounded Hades, Hera, and Ares. Remember, Ares was his friend. Hera was his enemy. He wrestled Achilles for the sake of a woman. And Achilles was the greatest wrestler in the world, supposedly, and he defeated him, and so he took Deianira as his wife. Now, the centaur Nessus tried to kidnap his wife, and we'll look at the story a little bit later, but Herakles shot him in the heart with an arrow. Now, Nessus gave Deianira, as he was dying, Deianira, a supposed love charm that was made from the blood that came out of his wound. It was poisonous blood. But instead of being a love charm that would ensure Herakles' love for Deianira forever, it ended up being a divine form of poisonous potion that would burn Herakles to death. So she put it on a cloak for Herakles to wear, and then he was immolated and self-immolated. So he burned up and was taken into Apothեosis by Zeus and given his eternal wife, his soulmate, whose name is Hebe. Now we have to remember that a hero is a demigod, half human and half divine. So in this representation we see of the baby or child Herakles, he's being held up before Zeus, who sits on the throne, and he has wings, which represents that he's a soul. He's not just a mortal, he's a mortal and an immortal. So he has both of the qualities of mortality and immortality. And these are the qualities, according to the mysteries and according to the Eleusinian mysteries, that all human beings have. This is a representation of the child, the 8-month-old. Now we have to remember that a hero, this is Now we have to remember that a hero is a demigod, half human and half divine. So in this representation we see of the baby or child Herakles, he's being held up before Zeus, who sits on the throne, and he has wings, which represents that he's a soul. He's not just a mortal, he's a mortal and an immortal. So he has both of the qualities of mortality and immortality. And these are the qualities, according to the mysteries and according to the Eleusinian mysteries, that all human beings have. This is a representation of the child, the 8-month-old child Herakles, killing the poisonous serpents who came to attack him in his bed, sent by Hera. This is a representation of Hermes, who is a protector of the child, Herakles, taking him away from danger and protecting him and providing his counsel and aid to him. Now Herakles always wore a leopard skin or a lion skin. The terms were interchangeable in Greek. And here we see his bearded face coming out the jaws of the head of the lion that he has conquered, killed, disemboweled, and skinned, and turned into his shamanic warrior's outfit. He has the power of the lion or the leopard. And here we see the relationship, the really strong, clear relationship between Herakles as a shamanic hero and the warrior heroes of the earlier shamanic prehistoric cultures, where the shamans dressed in a bear skin or the skin of a totem animal and delivered their oracles and their prophecies from within inside that dress. This is Chiron, the wise centaur who sacrificed and gave up his immortality for the sake of Prometheus, for the sake of human beings. And Prometheus was the savior of human beings. This is a representation of Herakles wearing his leopard skin during the 12th and final labor, the labor that requires initiation in the lesser mysteries at ELEUSIS. And this is a labor to descend into the divine underworld and bring back the 3-headed dog, Cerberus, and bring it back to his unworthy master, the person who succeeded to the kingship of the Mycenaeans, although he was unworthy because of Hera's trickery, and to whom he has been beholden as a servant to do all these great achievements, these great labors and tasks. And this is the 12th and greatest labor, to actually descend into the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed dog. This is a representation of Herakles killing the eagle, the invincible eagle that comes each day to tear out and eat the liver of Prometheus, who is bound to the rock in an eternal punishment for having brought immortality to humans. And he kills the eagle, and Chiron wills to him his own immortality. And Prometheus, who is really the kind of the Greek Christ crucified, is redeemed from this horrible torment. This is an illustration of Herakles, who's on the left-hand side with his club, struggling with his own benefactor, Apollo, one of the gods who gifted him, for Apollo's tripod, the tripod that the Oracle of Delphi sits upon, because Herakles is not satisfied with the second prophecy he goes to get from the Oracle at Delphi, and eventually he decides that he's going to take the tripod and deliver his own prophecy for himself. Now, after the completion of the 12th labor, which is the labor of bringing Cerberus up from the divine underworld, the completion of all of his initiations, a terrible thing happens. Cattle were stolen by a thief, a notorious thief, and Herakles was held responsible. But his close friend Iphitus did not believe that Herakles had done this and went to see him. And after meeting him, he invited him to seek the cattle with him, and Herakles promised to do so, but suddenly went mad again. And he threw Iphitus from the walls of Terines, killing him immediately. And now he needs to be purified for his guilt and the death of Iphitus. And remember, each one of these madnesses is a divine madness set upon him by Hera that he cannot overcome. So he could not find peace after this, and he went to Delphi and asked for questions of how he could redeem himself, how he could purify himself after these acts. And finally, not satisfied with the answers of the Pythian priestess, he plundered the temple and carried off the tripod with an idea of starting an oracle of his own. Now, Apollo opposed him, and Zeus finally threw a thunderbolt between them, but during that time they struggled for the tripod, and nevertheless, Herakles received an oracle, and it declared that the cure for his disease was for him to be sold and to serve for 3 years and to pay compensation for the death of Iphitus. And so Hermes, the god, sold Herakles, and he was bought by Omphale, the queen of Lydia. And it was at that time that he wore the women's clothing, and she wore his lion's dress, the shamanic dress, etc. And for 3 years he spends making atonement in this way. Now, the 12th and final labor, which was to bring Cerberus from Hades, before he descends into Hades, Herakles is initiated at Eleusis. And this initiation of Herakles becomes the archetypal and primal emblem of the lesser mysteries of Eleusis. They're also called the mysteries of Herakles. Now, when Herakles was about to go to fetch this creature from the underworld, he went to Eumolpus at Eleusis. This is the Eumolpidae priests, and he asked to be initiated, but it was not lawful at that time for foreigners to be initiated. And so he proposed to be initiated as the adoptive son of Peleus, but he had not been cleansed of the slaughter of the centaurs, so Eumolpus cleansed him in a special ceremony and then initiated him. Now, the best representation of an initiation ceremony we have is the Lobatelli cinerary urn and the Terranova sarcophagus, which shows images of this. I do not have those images to show you because they're not available. But I'm going to show you what I do have in a little while is when we talk about what this initiation was. During his descent into Hades, he also rescues Theseus, who is a great hero of the Cretan Minoans and the defeater of the Minotaur, and he has been imprisoned in Hades, and so he rescues this great hero from Hades, pulls him from the divine underworld. Now, after these events, he marries the woman that is his final wife, Deianira. And when they are crossing a stream, a centaur offered to ferry them across the river, but and Herakles waded across the river, but the centaur instead stole his wife and started kidnapping her and trying to make away. And even though the image shows here Herakles smashing him with his club, he actually shot him with poisoned arrows and killed the centaur. However, as the centaur was dying, the centaur told Deianira that if she were to take his blood and put it on a cloak, it would be a love potion that would cause Herakles to love her forever. And foolishly, she believed this. In fact, the blood of the centaur is absolutely deadly poison. So she soaked a cloak with the blood of the centaur, and she gave it to her husband and asked him to wear it. Now, I have to preface what's about to happen by explaining that death by fire, or immolation, or by a lightning strike from Zeus, or by jumping into volcanic lava so that the physical body is partially reduced to ashes or completely reduced to ashes, is the archetypal hero's gateway to apotheosis. Empedocles, we are told, ended his life by leaping into the volcanic pools of a volcanic mountain. Other heroes were apotheosized by being struck by lightning by Zeus, which was the kiss of immortality. In the case of Herakles, is consumed totally by fire, because when he puts on the cloak, it begins to burn him, and finally he bursts totally into flame and is completely incinerated, to the horror of everybody watching, including his close associates. And what happens? Well, in the story, Zeus himself comes down in a chariot and takes the soul of Herakles into the starry sky, into the heavens of the divine underworld, because there are two skies, a day sky and the night sky. The night sky is part of the divine underworld, and informs the people there that Herakles is not dead. He is alive, he is immortal, and he has achieved apotheosis. Now, in this representation, what we actually seem to have below is a funeral pyre, and we don't have Zeus, but actually Apollo, who is taking the soul of Herakles to the sky. So here we have Herakles depicted as a constellation among the stars. To our right, we see a representation of the Milky Way, and the stars then that would form his constellation. Here is another representation of Herakles ascended and apotheosized. So the divine starry sky, the night sky, is a part of the underworld, and it is the place where heroes are immortalized. And when he is welcomed into the realm of the gods, he is given a wife, and her name is Hebe. And this is a representation on an urn of Herakles receiving his true wife, his true soulmate, and living forever in the heavens of the gods. Now you can see that this allegorizes the struggle and strife of a person and could be understood to allegorize the spiritual striving of each of us through the trials of life, in spite of our mistakes, which come upon us not just because of our own errors, but because of forces that are much greater than we can control. Yet we must seek to expiate the sins and the wrong things that we do and to make them right. And if we strive to the very end, and even at the very end, we will feel like we have failed. We will feel like we've all come to disaster. Then we are apotheosized and brought immortality. And this is the lesson. This is the kind of lesson that is drawn from the stories of Herakles. The classic 12 labors of Herakles or Hercules are assigned a certain order chronologically, but as they were interpreted spiritually by the philosophers and many other people that saw Herakles as the archetype of the spiritual hero, they were arranged by zodiacal signs, so that for example, something that related to a lion would be associated with Leo and so on. And so these 12 labors of Hercules or Herakles became allegorized as spiritual labors of the sort that represent the kinds of stages of spiritual initiation that all of us go through in the myth and allegory of our everyday lives. Now, his great works were done all over the known world. They were done as far east as the lands of the Amazons in Asia Minor, and as far west as the Pillars of Hercules, or Herakles, that were named after him for his mighty deeds. Most of them were done in the area of the Greek and Achaean civilization, including one on the Isle of Crete.